How do we know that this prophecy was not written afterwards? Okay, which that's a valid question. How do we know that Luke, because this is from the Gospel of Luke, okay? How do we know that Luke didn't just make up Jesus saying this basically and say like, look, this is what Jesus said after the city had already been destroyed? How do we know that Luke didn't just write this down to make Jesus look like an amazing prophet? Okay, so that is a valid question, and we are going to go ahead and answer that right now. So Luke wrote the Gospel of Luke, obviously, but he also wrote the book of Acts. And in the first verse of the book of Acts, he says, in the first book, so the first book is Luke, O Theophilus, I've dealt with all that Jesus began to do and to teach. So the first book he's talking about is obviously Luke, okay? So Luke wrote the book of Luke, and then he went on to write the book of Acts. Here's where it gets interesting, because in Acts, he records some lesser known martyrs. So the stoning of Stephen in Acts 7:56 through 60. He records the stoning of Stephen, and the stoning of Stephen happened around 33 to 36 AD, okay? So he records the stoning of Stephen, which is a lesser known martyr in the book of Acts, okay? He also records the martyrdom of James, the brother of John, in Acts 12, verse 2, okay? So not a prominent figure at all in the book of Acts, okay? So Luke records the martyrdom of Stephen and James in Acts, but he doesn't mention, now get this guys, Peter is the main character in the first 12 chapters of Acts, okay? Paul is the primary focus for the later half of Acts, okay? So he records the martyrdom of Stephen and James in Acts, but he does not record the martyrdom of Peter or Paul, okay? Peter and Paul are the two main characters in the book of Acts. So here's the $1 million question, okay? So if Acts, and remember Luke wrote Acts, and he also wrote Luke, where the prophecy of the destruction of Jerusalem is recorded in Luke. So if this prophecy and Acts were written after Peter and Paul died, why wouldn't Luke mention their martyrdoms, okay? Like, why wouldn't he say anything about it? The simplest explanation, guys, is because they hadn't happened yet, okay? So the reason that Luke does not record Peter and Paul's martyrdom is because they had not taken place. But why is this important, okay? Because Peter, his martyrdom happened in 64 AD, okay? Paul, his happened somewhere between 64 and 68 AD, okay? And then the destruction of Jerusalem happened in 70 AD, okay? Obviously, that's before the siege and the destruction of Jerusalem happened. Guys, you gotta understand, okay? The destruction of Jerusalem was the biggest event for the Jews in the first century, okay? So think about like the capital of the United States getting destroyed, okay? So that's how big, that's how like massive this event is, obviously. So obviously if this event had happened, Luke would have written it down, or he would have mentioned it, but yet he records smaller, less significant prophecies, okay? So the famine in the days of Claudius, which happened in the 40s AD, he makes a point to say in Acts 11:28 that this took place in the days of Claudius. But Luke never says that Jesus' prophecy about the destruction of Jerusalem took place in the days of Titus, okay? So why? Obviously because it had not happened yet. It had not taken place. So guys, again, like, not including this event, if it had been written afterwards, if Luke had just made this up, all right, made up that Jesus like said this prophecy after the city of Jerusalem had been destroyed, this would be the equivalent of the capital of the US being completely destroyed and not being included in the history books, okay? That is what this is like. If Luke wrote the book of Luke after the city was destroyed and didn't mention it, so this is how we know that it wasn't written afterwards, and that Luke wrote down what Jesus said about what was going to happen. This is how we know that Jesus predicted it before it happened and that Luke didn't just write it down afterwards, okay?